beginning Robert Louis Wilken's The First 1,000 Years, A Global History of Christianity. I do have a pretty bad cold. There might be a lot of stops. This is from Yale University Press, 2012. Skipping the acknowledgments. Beginning with the introduction on page 1. What power preserves what once was if memory does not last? These words from the Lithuanian poet Czesław Miłosz kept coming to mind as I was writing this book. The past doesn't vanish at once, it dies slowly, but if remembered, the dead maintain their ground and live among us. Historical memory, like all memory, is selective, and there are many claimants to the telling of Christianity's early history. The Christian Church has a long and crowded past, and whether by design, forgetfulness, or ignorance, its history will be remembered in different ways. Our knowledge of the past is not objective, but personal and participatory. In writing the history of the first 1,000 years, I have chosen to highlight those events and persons that, in my judgment, are worthy of remembrance at the beginning of the third millennium. In many books on early Christianity, the accent falls on the first several centuries, and for good reason. The formulation of the Church's central beliefs, the development of its distinctive practices, and the establishment of its most enduring institutions took place during the first 5 centuries. Christianity did not come into the world full-blown, and these years will have a resonance without parallel in any account of Christian history. The story of beginnings, however, requires a wider horizon. Only toward the end of the first millennium did the form Christianity took in history come fully into view. I begin with Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century and end with the baptism of Vladimir, the Rus prince, in Kiev at the close of the millennium in 988. By the year 1000, the map of the early Christian world was largely complete. The emergence of Christianity brought about one of the most profound revolutions the world has known, and the principal theme of this book is the slow drama of the building of a Christian civilization. The Church's history is more than the history of a religious community. Christianity is a culture-forming religion, and the planting and growing of Christian communities led to the remaking of the cultures of the ancient world, along with the creation of a new civilization, or, more accurately, several new civilizations. One mark of culture is language, and as I read the ancient sources afresh, I marvel at the primacy of language. Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Slavonic, and even Arabic, as Christians in the Middle East adapted to the rule of Islam in the spread of Christianity. Christianity has no sacred tongue, but it cannot exist without books. In some cases, among the Armenians or Slavs, it was Christians who first wrote down the oral languages of the new Christian peoples. Culture has to do with the pattern of inherited meanings and sensibilities embedded in rituals, institutions, laws, practices, images, and stories of a people. But it also includes tangible products of human activity that can be seen and touched. In the first 2 centuries, Christianity was largely invisible to the inhabitants of the cities in which Christians lived. But by the beginning of the 3rd century, the first signs of a Christian material culture appeared in Rome. The Christian community bought a plot of land and constructed the catacomb of Calixtus, an underground columbarium where Christians buried their dead and gathered to worship. About the same time, small oil lamps with Christian designs and figures began to be produced. In the 4th century, the construction of churches presented a very public face in the ancient cities, and those who stepped inside beheld pictures of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and scenes from biblical history in vivid color. Christians created laws to govern their life of their communities and established the first hospitals to care for the sick. Music, too, was a sign of the new culture, and one of the most far-reaching developments was the invention of Christian monks of a system of notation to write down musical melodies. Until that happened, what was sung could be transmitted only by memory from one singer to another, a fallible undertaking. With the invention of the stave, it was possible to learn a melody without having heard it sung by someone who knew it. In much writing on the early history of Christianity, theological ideas played a major role, especially in accounts of the great controversies over the doctrines of the Trinity and the person of Christ. That is right and good, but institutions were vitally important, and the 3 that figure large were the office of the bishop, monasticism, and kingship, or empirical rule. Whether one is speaking about Gaul, Egypt, or Persia, one always finds bishops and monks. And as new peoples, such as the Ethiopians or the English or the Bulgarians, embraced Christian faith, it was a king or queen who opened the way for the introduction of Christian practices and beliefs. Religion was not a private affair, and the moderns forget that in ancient times the world was ruled by emperors and kings. There was no future for Christianity that did not include the blessing of temporal rulers. When the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, And the church was no longer a small association living in the shadows. It was a vibrant and visible community with resourceful leaders and a network of communications, a keen sense of its own tradition, and a large constituency. As the church's rituals became civic celebrations, its way of life changed the rhythm of society. For Rome, the alliance with Christianity came late, outside the empire, in Ethiopia or Armenia, and later in early medieval Europe. The Christian mission began at the top, and the king became the head of the Christian people. Conversion was not a warming of the heart, but a change of public practice. The account of the early centuries, however, would be incomplete without the stories of the many memorable persons who give life and vigor to the narrative, the indomitable missionaries who set out to preach the gospel among new peoples, Boniface the Apostle to the Germans, or Augustine to the English, Macrina, who influenced the form of monasticism in Asia Minor, and the Empress Theodora, who sent missionaries to Nubia and Black Africa. The translators who wrote down the oral language of new Christian people to make possible translations of the Bible and the liturgy, Cyril and the Methodius among the Slavs, Mashtots the Armenian, Anthony of Baghdad, who translated Christian texts into Arabic, poets such as Ephraim and Syrian, Romanos, Melados the Greek, Prudentius the Spaniard, the bishops, popes, and patriarchs who guided the Christian people, Cyprian, bishop of Carthage and martyr, Ambrose of Milan, Pope Gregory the Great, and Timothy Catholicos, patriarch. Of the Church of the East in Baghdad, deeply original thinkers, such as Origen of Alexandria, Augustine of Hippo, and Maximus the Confessor, Basil, bishop of Caesarea, who built the first hospital, monks who formed enduring religious communities, Chenault the Copt in Egypt, and Benedict in Italy, emperors who gave form to the new civilizations, Constantine, Justinian, Charlemagne, scholars who transmitted ancient learnings, Cassiodorus, Isidore of Seville, and Photius of Constantinople, Abu Qurra, the first Christian to write theological works in Arabic. All these persons and many others have a place in the narrative. I have made the rise and spread of Islam integral to the history. No event in the first millennium of Christian history was more catastrophic than the Muslim conquest of Christian lands, and none more consequential. For centuries, Christianity had spread around the Mediterranean Sea, throughout the Middle East and farther into Central Asia, India, and China. But in the 7th century, most of the lands on the southern coast of the Mediterranean and all of the Middle East and Central Asia swiftly came under Muslim rule. Today, this large geographical area is still ruled by Muslims, and Christianity has either disappeared, as in Algeria and Tunisia, ancient North Africa, or been gradually reduced to a minority of the population, as in the Middle East. The extraordinary success of Christianity in the first millennium must be set alongside the dramatic rise of Islam and the decline of Christianity. In historical Christian lands, it is the story of Christianity is told solely from the perspective of the West. An essential element is ignored. To give the reader a sense of the magnitude of the impact of the Islamic conquest on Christians, I devote 4 chapters to the rise and spread of Islam and the momentous changes Muslim rule brought to Christian communities in the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. In each geographical area, the story takes a different course. In Greater Syria and Iraq, Christians adopted the language of their conquerors as their own and created a large and diverse body of Christian writings in Arabic. In Egypt, Christians held on to their narrative language, Coptic, while at the same time eventually adopting Arabic, and were able to maintain a unique identity in a Muslim society. Today, the Copts are the largest Christian community in the Middle East. In North Africa, Christianity disappeared, and no indigenous Christians remain in countries such as Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria. Some Christians in Spain adopted Arabic, but others held on to the traditional Latin culture. Significantly, the first translations of the Quran into Latin took place in Spain. I have subtitled this book, A Global History of Christianity. When I began to do research, I wanted to show the wide geographical reach of Christianity in the first millennium, but only as I read more broadly and learned more about Christianity in such regions as Armenia, Persia, Ethiopia, Central Asia, India, and China, did I realize how energetic and enterprising the mission to spread the Christian gospel was, and what a vast reach it had in the early centuries. For example, there is a first-hand testimony to the existence of a Christian community in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Timothy I, the Catholicos of the Syriac-speaking Church of the East in Baghdad, commissioned a bishop for Tibet. The 4th to 10th centuries were a remarkable age in the history of Christian missions. Christianity is transcultural and migratory, and each integration with a new people and language brought changes in how Christians practice their faith. At the same time, Christian rituals such as baptism and the Eucharist, the Bible, the Nicene Creed, the office of bishop, and monasticism bound Christians in a spiritual unity that transcended the deep cultural differences. The date 1000 is not sacrosanct. It works well for the Byzantine and Slavic East because the Rus prince Vladimir was baptized at the end of the first millennium. In the Latin West, however, I have brought the story to a close with the reign of Charlemagne. By the early 9th century, when he died, Christianity in Western Europe had assumed the shape it would have for the next 800 years. In the Middle East, I end with the first flowering of Arabic Christian literature in the 9th century, a time of extraordinary intellectual creativity in the East beyond Jerusalem. I have written for a general reader who may have little background in the history of Christianity. The chapters are short, and I've sought to keep the narrative moving. There is a vast body of scholarship on the early history of Christianity, and the interpretation of many of the topics I discuss continues to be debated by historians. But that discussion belongs properly in scholarly articles and monographs. My aim is to depict the central developments in Central Christian history with an eye to the form of Christianity that spread around the ancient world and endured in the Middle Ages. The notes are few, but I have included a section of books for further reading and a list of translations of works from which many of the quotations are taken. In the case of quotations from the Bible, most use the Revised Standard Version, but in some cases I've translated from the ancient original versions, such as the Latin. I am skipping over to page 373. Scanning suggested readings. Translations, page 377.